The Caribbean Sea stretches before us like a vast mirror of turquoise and sapphire, its gentle waves whispering secrets of an age when these waters ran red with blood and gleamed with stolen Spanish gold. This is not the sanitized pirate fantasy of Hollywood blockbusters, where charming rogues swing from ship rigging while delivering witty one-liners. This is the true story of desperate men and women who created societies so radical, so fundamentally democratic, that they threaten the very foundations of European colonial power. Close your eyes and imagine the year 1715. The War of Spanish Succession has just ended, and thousands of sailors who served aboard privateering vessels suddenly find themselves unemployed. These are not common criminals, but skilled mariners who have tasted combat, learned navigation, and discovered something far more dangerous than any cutlass. They have experienced the intoxicating freedom of life beyond the rigid social hierarchies of European civilization. Our journey begins not in the romanticized Caribbean of popular imagination, but in the harsh reality of early 18th century colonial society. Picture a world where your birth determined your destiny with iron certainty, where the color of your skin could condemn you to lifetime bondage, where questioning authority could result in brutal punishment or death. Into this world of suffocating hierarchies stepped individuals who would dare to imagine something different, a society where every voice carried equal weight, where wealth was shared according to contribution rather than inherited privilege, where a man's worth was measured by his courage and competence rather than the circumstances of his birth. The transformation of these tropical waters into history's most infamous pirate sanctuary did not occur overnight. It began with humble hunters on a forgotten island, men who never intended to become the scourge of the Spanish Main. On Hispaniola, that vast island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, groups of European castaways and deserters had learned to survive by hunting the wild pigs that roamed the dense interior forests. They constructed special wooden structures called boucans where they smoked their meat, earning themselves the name boucaniers, buccaneers. These weathered men, their skin bronzed by the relentless tropical sun and their bodies hardened by years of harsh existence, possessed skills that would prove invaluable in the conflicts to come. They could track prey through impossible terrain, survive for weeks on minimal provisions, and shoot with deadly accuracy, talents that translated remarkably well to the business of maritime warfare. As tensions between European powers escalated across the Atlantic world, colonial governors began to recognize opportunity in these skilled hunters and their intimate knowledge of Caribbean waters. The governors of islands like Jamaica started issuing letters of marque, official documents that transformed common criminals into privateers, legally sanctioned pirates operating under the protection of their sponsoring nation. What began as a calculated military strategy would unleash forces that even monarchs could not ultimately control. The Caribbean itself seemed designed by nature for piracy. Thousands of small islands dotted the region, each offering countless hidden bays and secret anchorages where ships could vanish from pursuing naval vessels. The native populations, decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles, had left these islands largely empty, creating perfect bases for criminal enterprises. Yellow fever and malaria stalked European naval crews unfamiliar with tropical diseases, while seasoned pirates had either developed immunity or accepted death as an occupational hazard. Into this perfect storm of geography and geopolitics stepped men whose names would echo through the centuries. But perhaps none would capture the imagination quite like a former English sailor whose real name was Edward Teach, though the world would remember him by a different title entirely. Blackbeard, as he came to be known, understood something fundamental about the psychology of terror that most pirates missed entirely. Standing well over 6 feet tall at a time when the average man barely reached 5.5 feet, Edward Teach possessed a natural advantage in intimidation. But it was his theatrical genius that transformed him from a common pirate into a legend that parents would use to frighten misbehaving children for generations. Before battle, Teach would weave hemp fibers soaked in saltpeter into his massive black beard, then ignite them so that his head appeared wreathed in demonic smoke. The image of this towering figure emerging from the gun smoke of naval combat, his face obscured by flickering flames and his eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, proved so terrifying that many ships surrendered without firing a single shot. The supreme irony of Blackbeard's fearsome reputation lay in a fact that historians would discover centuries later. Despite his terrifying appearance and bloodthirsty legend, Edward Teach had never actually killed a single person in battle before his final confrontation. His success came not from brutality, but from psychological warfare so effective that violence became unnecessary. When sailors spotted those distinctive black sails on the horizon and caught sight of that smoking apparition on the quarterdeck, resistance simply melted away. Teach's flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge, represented the pinnacle of pirate engineering and intimidation. Originally a French slave ship called La Concorde, Teach had captured and modified her into a floating fortress mounting 40 cannons and crewed by over 300 desperate men from across the Atlantic world. The ship's very appearance struck fear into merchant captains, her black hull decorated with carved skulls, her rigging hung with the tattered flags of defeated enemies. But Blackbeard's reign of terror could not last forever. The same governors who had once welcomed pirates as unofficial naval auxiliaries now found their creations had grown beyond control. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, facing increasing pressure from London to restore order to colonial shipping lanes, placed a bounty of £100 on Teach's head, dead or alive. The sum represented a fortune to common sailors, and it attracted the attention of Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard, a professional officer who understood that his career depended on eliminating the pirate threat. The final confrontation came on November 22, 1718, in the shallow waters off Ocracoke Island in North Carolina. Maynard had tracked Blackbeard to this remote anchorage, gambling that the pirate's overconfidence would lead him to underestimate the determination of his pursuers. The battle that followed would mark not just the end of Edward Teach, but the beginning of the end for the golden age of Caribbean piracy. As dawn broke over the inlet, two sloops flying Royal Navy colors approached the anchorage where Queen Anne's Revenge lay at anchor. Blackbeard, awakening to find enemy vessels within cannon range, quickly realized he faced the most serious threat of his piratical career. But the man who had terrorized the Caribbean for years was not about to surrender without a fight that would enter maritime legend. The engagement began with a thunderous exchange of cannon fire that echoed across the water like rolling thunder. Blackbeard, despite being outgunned, used his superior knowledge of local waters to maneuver his ship into positions where the deeper draft Navy vessels couldn't follow. For hours, the three ships played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the shoals and sandbars that dotted the inlet. But Lieutenant Maynard had anticipated this strategy. Rather than pursue the pirate ship into waters where his vessels might run aground, he ordered his men to wait patiently at the mouth of the inlet. Blackbeard, running low on ammunition and facing the prospect of being trapped in the anchorage, made the fateful decision to break out through the Navy blockade. What followed was perhaps the most savage hand-to-hand combat in the history of Caribbean piracy. As Queen Anne's Revenge attempted to ram past the Navy sloops, grappling hooks flew across the narrowing gap between ships. Pirates and sailors alike drew cutlasses and pistols as the vessels crashed together in a chaos of splintering wood and screaming men. Blackbeard himself led the boarding party that swarmed across the gap between ships, his massive frame cutting through Navy resistance like a scythe through grain. Witnesses later reported that the pirate captain fought with the fury of a man possessed, wielding both cutlass and pistol with deadly effect. But even the most fearsome pirate could not withstand the combined assault of a dozen determined sailors. When the smoke finally cleared, Edward Teach lay dead on the blood-soaked deck, his body bearing 25 stab wounds and 5 gunshot wounds. Lieutenant Maynard, following the grisly customs of the age, ordered the pirate's head severed and hung from his ship's bowsprit as proof of the kill. Blackbeard's headless body was thrown overboard, where local legend claimed it swam around the ship 3 times before finally sinking beneath the waves. The death of Blackbeard sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean pirate community. If the most feared pirate captain of the age could be hunted down and killed, then no pirate was truly safe from the growing reach of royal justice. But the golden age of piracy was far from over, and other legends were already being born in the hidden coves and secret harbors of the Spanish Main. Among the most remarkable of these emerging figures were two women whose very existence challenged every assumption about gender roles in the violent world of Caribbean piracy. And Bonnie and Mary Red would prove that courage, cunning, and ruthlessness were not exclusively masculine virtues, and their partnership would become one of the most celebrated and mysterious chapters in pirate history. And Bonnie's path to piracy began in the taverns and brothels of Nassau, that lawless Bahamian port that had become the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy. Born in Ireland but raised in the American colonies, she possessed a fiery temperament that had already led to scandal and violence before she ever set foot on a pirate vessel. Her marriage to James Bonny, a small-time sailor and sometime pirate, had been tumultuous from the start, marked by jealousy, violence, and mutual infidelity. When Anne met John Rackham, known throughout the Caribbean as Calico Jack for his flamboyant dress and colorful personality, the attraction was immediate and explosive. Rackham represented everything that James Bonny was not: successful, charismatic, and dangerously attractive to a woman seeking adventure beyond the confines of colonial society. Their affair scandalized even the notoriously permissive society of Nassau, where prostitutes and pirates mingled freely in taverns that never closed. But Anne Bonny's most significant relationship would prove to be with another woman whose own journey to piracy was even more extraordinary. Mary Read had spent most of her life disguised as a man, a deception that began in childhood when her mother dressed her as a boy to claim inheritance money intended for a deceased male heir. This early experience with gender deception had taught Mary that the world offered far more opportunities to those who could successfully navigate its masculine domains. When these two remarkable women joined Calico Jack's crew in 1720, they brought skills and perspectives that would transform the very nature of pirate operations in the Caribbean. Unlike their male counterparts, who often relied on brute force and intimidation, Bonny and Red combined their combat abilities with tactical intelligence and psychological insight that made them invaluable members of any pirate crew. Their criminal partnership reached its peak during the summer and autumn of 1720, when Rackham's crew embarked on a series of raids that demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of pirate operations in an increasingly hostile environment. Operating primarily in the waters around Jamaica and the northern Caribbean, they targeted merchant vessels and coastal settlements with a precision that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of local shipping patterns. But the very success that made them famous also attracted the attention of authorities who were becoming increasingly effective at hunting down pirates. The Royal Navy had expanded its Caribbean presence dramatically since Blackbeard's death, and colonial governors now possessed both the resources and the political will to eliminate piracy once and for all. The end came swiftly and dramatically on a moonless night in October 1720, when Captain Jonathan Barnett, commanding a heavily armed sloop commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, surprised Rackham's crew while they were anchored in a secluded bay. The pirates, many of them drunk on captured rum, were caught completely off guard by the sudden appearance of the government vessel. What followed was a battle that would become legendary, not for its duration or intensity, but for the stark contrast it revealed between the courage of the women pirates and the cowardice of their male companions. As Barnett's men swarmed aboard the pirate vessel, most of Rackham's crew fled below decks or cowered behind whatever cover they could find. Only Anne Bonny and Mary Red remained on deck, fighting desperately to repel the boarders with cutlass and pistol. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of almost surreal violence, with two women in men's clothing standing back-to-back against overwhelming odds while their male crewmates abandoned them to face capture or death alone. And Bonny, her red hair streaming behind her as she wielded her cutlass with deadly precision, shouted curses at the hidden men that would have made seasoned sailors blush. Mary Red, her disguise finally abandoned, fought with the cold efficiency of a professional soldier, her movements economical and lethal. But courage alone could not overcome superior numbers and firepower. Within minutes, both women were overwhelmed and captured, joining their male companions in the ship's hold as prisoners bound for Jamaica and almost certain execution. The golden age of Caribbean piracy was entering its final phase, and even the most legendary figures would soon discover that the world was changing in ways that made their way of life impossible to sustain. As our journey through these blood-soaked waters continues, we must examine how a Welsh privateer named Henry Morgan built an empire of terror that made him both the most feared pirate in the Caribbean and eventually the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. We'll explore the democratic societies that pirates created aboard their ships, complete with written constitutions and elected leadership that wouldn't look out of place in a modern democracy. And we'll visit Port Royal, the wickedest city on earth, where pirates and prostitutes lived in luxury until divine judgment struck in the form of a catastrophic earthquake that swallowed most of the city beneath the waves. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Spanish Town as Henry Morgan strode through streets lined with merchants hawking their wares and sailors stumbling from taverns that had never truly closed. But this was not the Henry Morgan of legend, the feared buccaneer whose very name could empty Spanish ports from Cartagena to Veracruz. This was Sir Henry Morgan, newly knighted by King Charles himself and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica, a transformation so complete it defied belief. Morgan's journey from cattle hunter to colonial administrator represented the strange alchemy of Caribbean politics, where today's pirate could become tomorrow's governor if he possessed sufficient cunning and ruthlessness. Born in Wales around 1635, Morgan had arrived in the Caribbean as a young man seeking fortune in a world where traditional social hierarchies meant nothing and success belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The transformation began in the smoking ruins of Portobello, that heavily fortified Spanish port on the Panamanian coast that guarded the treasure routes connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. In 1668, Morgan had led 400 buccaneers in an assault that demonstrated both his tactical genius and his complete disregard for conventional military wisdom. While Spanish commanders expected any attack to come from the sea, Morgan landed his forces miles away and approached the fortress through dense jungle that military experts considered impassable. The battle for Portobello revealed Morgan's understanding of psychological warfare that rivaled even Blackbeard's theatrical genius. Rather than simply storm the fortress walls, he forced captured Spanish civilians to carry scaling ladders and approach the ramparts ahead of his men. The Spanish defenders, faced with the choice between firing on their own people or allowing the pirates to advance, hesitated long enough for Morgan's forces to overwhelm their positions. But it was the aftermath of victory that truly established Morgan's reputation for both brilliance and brutality. Rather than simply looting the town and departing, he held the entire population hostage while demanding an enormous ransom from the Spanish colonial government. For weeks, his men occupied Portobello while negotiations proceeded, during which time they systematically tortured prominent citizens to reveal the locations of hidden treasure. The wealth seized at Portobello exceeded anything previously captured by Caribbean pirates. Spanish records discovered centuries later in Seville archives revealed that Morgan's raid had netted over 200,000 pieces of eight, a sum that would be worth tens of millions in modern currency. More importantly, the psychological impact of the victory reverberated throughout the Spanish Caribbean, where colonial officials realized that no port, regardless of its fortifications, was truly safe from buccaneer assault. Morgan's success at Portobello established him as the undisputed leader of Caribbean buccaneers, but it also attracted the attention of more powerful forces. The English government, engaged in an increasingly complex diplomatic dance with Spain, found itself in the awkward position of simultaneously benefiting from Morgan's raids while officially condemning piracy. The solution was typically English in its elegant hypocrisy. Morgan would be granted semi-official status as a privateer, operating under letters of marque that made his attacks legally defensible while providing the crown with plausible deniability. The arrangement reached its pinnacle in 1671 with Morgan's most audacious enterprise, the assault on Panama City, the greatest Spanish stronghold on the Pacific coast, and the terminus of the treasure route that carried Peruvian silver across the isthmus to Caribbean ports. The expedition would require crossing 60 miles of some of the most hostile terrain in the Americas, through jungles filled with poisonous snakes, disease-carrying insects, and indigenous peoples who had learned to hate all Europeans with equal fervor. Morgan assembled a fleet of 37 vessels carrying nearly 2,000 men, the largest buccaneer force ever assembled in Caribbean waters. This multinational army included English deserters, French adventurers, Dutch merchants seeking profit, escaped African slaves, and indigenous allies who had their own reasons for wanting to see Spanish power broken. This diverse coalition represented the democratic ideals that would become central to pirate culture, where a man's worth was measured by his courage and skill rather than his birth or nationality. The crossing of the Panamanian Isthmus became an epic of endurance that tested even the hardiest buccaneers. Morgan's men abandoned their ships on the Caribbean coast and began a march through terrain that had defeated previous expeditions. Supplies ran low within days, forcing the army to subsist on whatever they could hunt or forage from the hostile environment. Disease claimed dozens of lives, while others fell victim to indigenous attacks or simply disappeared into the green hell of the jungle. But Morgan's genius lay not just in his ability to inspire men to follow him into hell, but in his understanding of how to turn adversity into advantage. As his army grew more desperate, their motivation for reaching Panama City intensified. The promise of Spanish gold became not just a dream of wealth, but a matter of survival for men who had burned their bridges and committed themselves to victory or death. When the exhausted buccaneers finally emerged from the jungle and saw the spires of Panama City gleaming in the Pacific sunlight, they faced the largest Spanish army ever assembled to oppose a pirate force. The governor of Panama had gathered over 3,000 soldiers, including regular troops sent from Spain, colonial militia, and indigenous auxiliaries. The Spanish possessed superior numbers, better equipment, and the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. The Battle of Panama demonstrated why Henry Morgan had become the most feared buccaneer in the Caribbean. Rather than launching a frontal assault against prepared Spanish positions, he divided his forces and attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. While one group of buccaneers engaged the Spanish army on the main approach to the city, other units circled around to attack from unexpected angles. The complex maneuver required precise timing and absolute trust between commanders, qualities that Spanish military doctrine insisted were impossible among undisciplined pirates. The Spanish defense collapsed within hours, not from superior buccaneer firepower but from the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that refused to follow conventional military rules. Spanish soldiers trained to fight European armies found themselves facing opponents who emerged from the jungle like phantoms, struck with devastating effect, and melted away before organized resistance could develop. The rigid command structure that gave Spanish forces their strength in conventional warfare became a liability when facing an enemy that operated according to different principles entirely. The sack of Panama City that followed the military victory established new standards for both the wealth and the destruction that buccaneer raids could achieve. Spanish colonial records preserved in archives from Mexico City to Madrid document the systematic looting of the richest city on the Pacific coast. Churches were stripped of their golden altars, private homes ransacked for hidden treasure, and government buildings emptied of the silver reserves that funded Spanish colonial administration. But the destruction went beyond mere theft. Morgan's men, driven by years of accumulated hatred for Spanish colonial policies, systematically destroyed what they could not carry away. Churches were burned, government buildings demolished, and the city's infrastructure so thoroughly wrecked that Panama City had to be rebuilt several miles from its original location. The level of destruction shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to the brutalities of colonial warfare. The psychological impact of Panama's fall reverberated throughout the Spanish Empire like an earthquake. For over a century, Spanish colonists had believed their Pacific coast settlements were protected by the impenetrable barrier of the Panamanian jungle. Morgan's successful crossing demonstrated that no Spanish possession was truly safe from buccaneer assault, a realization that forced fundamental changes in colonial defense strategy and trade route planning. But Morgan's greatest triumph also marked the beginning of his transformation from pirate to politician. The wealth captured at Panama was so enormous that it attracted the attention of European governments whose previous tolerance for Caribbean piracy evaporated when faced with the implications of successful large-scale raids. The Treaty of Madrid, signed between England and Spain in 1670, officially ended the policy of using privateers against Spanish colonial possessions. King Charles, caught between diplomatic necessity and reluctance to abandon a successful policy, chose a characteristically devious solution. Morgan would be arrested and brought to London for trial, satisfying Spanish demands for justice. But the trial would be a carefully orchestrated performance designed to enhance rather than destroy Morgan's reputation, setting the stage for his eventual return to Jamaica in an official capacity. The London trial of Henry Morgan became one of the great theatrical events of the Restoration period. Morgan, dressed in the finest clothes that Spanish gold could buy, appeared before judges who were secretly sympathetic to his achievements. Witnesses testified to his military genius, his loyalty to the English crown, and his role in expanding English influence in the Caribbean. The prosecution, hampered by government instructions to avoid seriously damaging Morgan's reputation, could do little more than go through the motions of seeking justice. The verdict was inevitable. Morgan was found guilty of unauthorized military action but recommended for royal mercy based on his services to English interests. King Charles, following a script written months earlier, not only pardoned the buccaneer but knighted him and appointed him lieutenant governor of Jamaica. The pirate who had terrorized Spanish America became Sir Henry Morgan, representative of royal authority in the Caribbean. Morgan's appointment as lieutenant governor represented more than personal advancement. It symbolized the English government's recognition that Caribbean piracy had evolved beyond simple criminality into a form of irregular warfare that could advance national interests more effectively than conventional military action. The buccaneers who had once operated outside legal authority now found themselves transformed into instruments of imperial policy. But the most remarkable aspect of pirate society was not their capacity for violence, but their development of democratic institutions that would not look out of place in a modern republic. Aboard pirate vessels throughout the Caribbean, crews operated according to written constitutions called Articles of Agreement that guaranteed rights and freedoms unknown in the monarchical societies from which most pirates had fled. These pirate codes, far from being crude sets of rules governing criminal behavior, represented sophisticated attempts to create just societies based on principles of equality and shared governance. The articles drafted by Bartholomew Roberts, perhaps the most successful pirate captain of the Golden Age, established democratic procedures that European philosophers could only dream about. Every crew member possessed an equal vote in matters of importance, from selecting targets for attack to choosing new captains when leadership positions became vacant. The economic arrangements aboard pirate ships challenged every assumption about property and wealth distribution that dominated European society. Unlike merchant vessels, where common sailors received fixed wages regardless of the voyage's success, pirate crews shared captured wealth according to predetermined formulas that recognized each member's contribution to the enterprise. Captains and officers received larger shares, but the difference was modest compared to the vast inequalities that characterized legitimate maritime commerce. Roberts's code included provisions that seem remarkably progressive even by contemporary standards. Wounded pirates received compensation from the Common Fund, creating perhaps the world's first systematic disability insurance program. The code prohibited gambling with dice or cards for money, recognizing that such activities could destroy the social cohesion essential for successful pirate operations. Most remarkably, the articles guaranteed that decisions affecting the entire crew would be made by democratic vote rather than autocratic command. The implementation of these democratic principles created societies aboard pirate ships that offered freedoms unavailable anywhere else in the 18th century world. Former slaves who joined pirate crews found themselves treated as equals, participating in democratic decision-making processes and sharing in captured wealth according to the same formulas that applied to white crew members. This racial equality, while motivated by practical necessity rather than moral conviction, created integrated communities that would not be seen again until the civil rights movements of the 20th century. Women, though rare aboard pirate vessels, could also find opportunities for advancement that were impossible in conventional society. Beyond the famous examples of Bonnie and Mary Red, scattered records suggest that other women served aboard pirate ships in various capacities, from skilled sailors to medical practitioners. The democratic traditions of pirate society, combined with the practical need for competent crew members, created environments where gender restrictions that dominated land-based societies could be temporarily suspended. The religious tolerance practiced aboard many pirate ships reflected their international composition and democratic ideals. Crews that included English Protestants, Irish Catholics, French Huguenots, Spanish converts, and practitioners of African spiritual traditions could not afford the luxury of religious persecution. The practical necessities of shipboard life forced pirates to develop forms of religious accommodation that would not appear in mainstream European society for generations.
But perhaps the most significant democratic innovation of pirate society was the practice of electing captains and deposing them when they failed to meet crew expectations. Unlike the rigid hierarchies of naval and merchant vessels, pirate captains served at the pleasure of their crews and could be removed by majority vote. This system created a form of accountable leadership that European political theorists were only beginning to imagine. The democratic traditions of pirate society extended beyond individual ships to encompass entire communities of maritime criminals. Nassau, the Bahamian port that served as the unofficial capital of Caribbean piracy during the early 18th century, operated according to principles of collective self-governance that challenged the authority of European colonial empires. Located on New Providence Island in the Bahamas, Nassau possessed natural advantages that made it nearly ideal as a pirate base. The harbor could accommodate large numbers of vessels while remaining hidden from casual observation by passing ships. Shallow water surrounding the island prevented heavily armed naval vessels from approaching closely, while numerous channels and inlets provided escape routes when government forces did appear. More importantly, Nassau's isolation from effective colonial authority created a power vacuum that pirates filled with their own forms of governance. Beginning around 1706, when a Franco-Spanish assault devastated the legitimate colonial government, Nassau became a self-governing republic where pirates created institutions based on the democratic traditions they had developed aboard their ships. The governance structure that emerged represented a fascinating experiment in direct democracy that operated without formal constitution or legal framework. Major decisions affecting the community were made in public assemblies where any pirate in good standing could participate. These gatherings, held in taverns and on the beach, addressed questions ranging from the allocation of harbor space to the organization of collective defense against government attempts to reassert control. The economic system that developed in Nassau reflected the egalitarian principles that governed pirate ships. Rather than allowing successful captains to accumulate vast personal wealth while their followers remained poor, the community maintained institutions that redistributed resources and provided support for pirates between voyages. Tavern keepers, merchants, and craftsmen who served the pirate community were expected to offer fair prices and honest dealing, with violations subject to collective punishment. The social life of Nassau created a unique Caribbean community where traditional hierarchies based on birth, race, and nationality were temporarily suspended in favor of more meritocratic arrangements. Former slaves who had joined pirate crews found themselves welcomed as equals in Nassau's taverns and brothels. European deserters from various national backgrounds mingled freely with colonial-born pirates and indigenous peoples who had allied themselves with the maritime criminals. Women played more prominent roles in Nassau society than would have been possible in conventional colonial communities. Beyond the famous female pirates, numerous women operated businesses, managed households, and participated in the social networks that held the community together. The absence of traditional legal authority meant that women could accumulate property and exercise influence in ways that colonial law typically prevented.